Copland has become a cult figure in America. In his homeland, he enjoys the kind of popularity seldom achieved by contemporary composers in Europe. He was one of the first to capture the essence of American life in sound. One example is Hoedown from Rodeo.
Well, Hoedown is actually almost like, I don't know if it's actually a folk song. It's very hard sometimes in Copland. He used folk songs in his music, but he also wrote his own melodies that sound like folk songs. And he took folk songs and changed them into his own melodies. So you have everything from the real folk song to the real Copland and everything in between. So it's hard to say where is it a folk song and where is it Copland. And Hoedown is a good example of this.
Copland was born in Brooklyn on the 14th of November 1900, the youngest of 5 children. Right until his death in 1990, he maintained very close links with New York City. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Russia. Copland's father was originally called Kaplan, but later decided to adopt the Americanized form. The composer's parents ran a grocery and general store in Brooklyn, from which they made a modest but comfortable living. Sometimes as many as 12 employees worked in the store on Washington Avenue. Among Copland's childhood memories was the sight of his mother making out bills and writing price tickets. The composer spent a carefree childhood in Brooklyn. Because his parents devoted most of their time to running the business, Copland was often left to his own devices. But such freedom suited him just fine. A parking lot for container trucks now occupies the place where his parents' home once stood. Biographer Howard Pollock describes the Brooklyn of Copland's youth.
it was a very ethnically diverse community, and this was important in terms of Copland's education and makeup, because his person and his music represents a certain absorption of a very ethnically diverse culture. Gershwin was also from Brooklyn, but the Gershwin family, soon after Gershwin's birth, moved back to Manhattan, and he grew up on the Lower East Side, which was more of a ghetto kind of environment than the more middle class, more Americanized, shall we say, environment that Copland grew up in.
Copland began to compose music while still at school. His parents, however, showed little enthusiasm for their son's artistic ambitions, but did not discourage him. They paid for him to take lessons with Rubin Goldmark, a respected teacher of composition. Copland also became an avid concert-goer. He wanted to be a musician. In order to lay a firm foundation for his musical career, he left America in 1921 and travelled to Europe, to Paris. Witnessing the incredible vitality of the cultural scene in the French capital, Copland quickly realized that in America there was still pioneering work to be done. In Paris, he became a pupil of the legendary Nadia Boulanger, acknowledged as the mother of new music, who taught many of the 20th century's most distinguished composers. She recognized Copland's talent and gave him the encouragement he needed. Copland came into contact with Igor Stravinsky, for whom he maintained a very special regard throughout his life. Paris was the center of the European avant-garde, and Copland took a deep interest in every kind of art form, such as the paintings of Pablo Picasso, then regarded as revolutionary, and the newest productions in the world of ballet. Under the guidance of his teacher Nadia Boulanger, he made his first attempts at serious composition. When he played a new piano work in public, he himself was amazed at the audience's positive reaction.
After the concert in the Green Room, to my great surprise and pleasure, Monsieur Durand, of the famous French publishers, Durand and Company, came up to me and said, "Is that work of yours published?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, come and see me in my office, and perhaps we'd like to publish it." So I went to see him in his office, and he said, "Yes, definitely we would like to publish it. Here's a check for so many francs." It was about the equivalent of $25 or at most $50. I can't remember exactly. "Here's a check, and just sign here." So I would have given him the piece for nothing. I was so delighted to be published, especially by Debussy and Ravel's publisher. So I signed a piece of paper, and by golly, I sold the whole complete rights forever for about the equivalent of $50. My friend Harold Krummer says it's the only business mistake I ever made.
Copland was like a sponge. He absorbed this amazing cultural milieu. I should add, though, that Copland also traveled widely during his 3 years in Europe. He traveled to London, to Berlin, to Vienna, and other places, and all the while discovering things. He discovered, for instance, Mahler when he was in Vienna, and that was a great discovery.
The effects of Copland's involvement with the opulent world of sound created by Gustav Mahler would find expression many years later in his Third Symphony.
Copland wrote 3 symphonies. This is the only one that's really kind of the standard large orchestra, 4 movements, big emotional intentions. And I think, again, written just after the war, or at the end of the war, again, he was trying to capture the feeling of, America really moving forward in the new era. And I think he was seduced by the idea of the great 19th century German Romantic symphonic tradition, and where can that take us today?
When he returned to America from Paris in 1924, Copland brought with him a host of impressions. Over the next few years, he was to interpret them in his own way. Having been part of Europe's highly developed music scene, he wanted to create something similar for America. Not only did he want to establish an equally dynamic musical culture in the United States, he also had a vision of a distinctly American musical sound. Well aware of the task facing him and its future significance, he set to work with enormous energy.
He was very impressed with the sound of European music, how there was a German sound and a French sound. And he came home and he thought, well, what is the American sound? We're a country of people brought together from all over the world. And I think he found it in part through the American personality. And yes, I think his personality reflected the optimism and the directness of Americans of his generation.
One of his first pieces in the new style was Music for the Theatre, composed in 1925.
Music would capture the pep and what he called the pep and zip of American life, and he derived a lot of that from his knowledge of jazz. So one often finds competing rhythms in his music, much as one finds competing rhythms in jazz. He also derived some of his unique rhythmic style from just the energy and bustle of American life, of pedestrians walking, of machinery, of cars, buses, and trains.
An example of this typically American rhythmic style, the Clarinet Concerto, here in an historic recording with Benny Goodman, with Copland himself on the rostrum. From the beginning, Copland set out to provide a musical response to the challenges of the 20th century without making excessive demands on the listener. Even so, in the early days, his works were seen as something one has to get used to, revolutionary even. This attitude is illustrated by the remarks made about Copland's music by a conductor during a concert in the 1920s.
He came out to start the next piece, and just before he began, he suddenly turned around to the audience and said, if a young man at the age of 23 can write a work like the one you've just heard, in 5 years he'll be ready to commit murder. Well, of course, everybody laughed. And the paper the next morning had a headline, "Young composer to commit murder."
Not only in the 1920s, but well into old age, Copland needed New York City to stimulate his creative imagination.
He said, well, so much is going on in New York. It's really the center of music. He said, there's so much going on every night. He says, I don't go to it. Of course, I don't go to everything. In fact, he said, I don't go to anything. But like a man with a harem, I like to know it's there. And I think that was the appeal to New York for Copland, was that it was where the action was, and Copland always liked to be near where the action was.
New York in the 20s was a bastion of jazz and ragtime, musical forms that also inspired Debussy and Stravinsky. But life in the city was hard for Copland.
He established himself in the Upper West Side of Manhattan and lived actually a rather nomadic life, going from apartment to apartment for many years. It was the Depression years, and he had next to no money.
More often than not, he could only afford little one-room apartments, like the one on 135th Street. It was virtually impossible to play the piano without disturbing the neighbors. To save money, he regularly went to the YMCA canteen. The golden era of the 20s was none too golden for Copland.
He finally settled into the Empire Hotel, where he lived extremely simple, with just a bed and one piece of furniture, and he lived like that for many years.
Copland kept his room at the Empire Hotel until 1947, when he was 47 years old. Although after a few years he also rented a loft on 113th Street, room 1040 was the birthplace of works that were later to achieve phenomenal success. Among the compositions dating from the period are the ballet music for Billy the Kid, the piano and violin sonatas, and his piano concerto. He kept to a regular and disciplined work schedule.
I used to like to work in the evenings, just because the telephone tended to stop ringing and everybody was gone out for the evening if they were going any place, so that it was calm, sort of settled down from 8 to 12, let's say, 4 hours, where I could work undisturbed. And I've always been tend to be a night worker anyhow.
He composed at the piano, and for a while he felt somewhat self-conscious about that, because he felt that a real composer should be able to hear all of his music in his ear and sit at a desk and compose that way. He liked to try out ideas and sounds at the piano and felt rather self-conscious about that until he found out that Stravinsky also composed at the piano. So he figured if it was all right for Stravinsky, it was all right for him.
In the 1930s, Copland also began writing film scores. They included the soundtrack for the screen version of Our Town, Thornton Wilder's play that perfectly captured the spirit of contemporary small-town America. Although Copland's film music reached a wide audience, his name was known to very few. His big international breakthrough was still to come.
Copland for many years worked in obscurity and was not considered among the foremost American composers of his time, but that changed in the 1940s, especially with the success of Appalachian Spring in 1944, 1945. That was a turning point.
The legendary choreographer Martha Graham invited Copland to compose the score for her ballet Appalachian Spring, which depicts the lives of American pioneers isolated in a still uncharted land. At first, Appalachian Spring had no name at all. Copland simply called it Ballet for Martha.
I remember that Martha Graham made an appointment with me and told me she'd love to have me write a ballet score for her. And then she outlined the ballet, what was going to happen in it, the nature of it, but it had no title. I went to Mexico and that summer, and I worked on the ballet. I kept sending her back parts of it. And finally, I came back and stopped off in Washington where the ballet was in rehearsal. And the first thing I said to her was, "Martha, what have you called the ballet?" She said, "Appalachian Spring." "Oh," I said, "what a nice name. Where'd you get it?" She said, "Well, it's the name of a poem by Hart Crane." I said, "Well, does the poem have anything to do with your ballet?" She said, "No, I just like the title, and I used it." But I can't tell you how many times people have spoken to me after a performance of Appalachian Spring and said to me, "You know, when I hear your music, I can just see the Appalachians and feel spring."
To me, one of the great charms of Appalachian Spring is the size of the group, the incredible transparency of just 13 musicians. So rather than a full orchestra playing, you have this very delicate, even when we're playing strongly, it's very delicate and it's very intimate. You can really hear every musician, so it's like chamber music. And I think this chamber music sound reflects very much the feeling of just the small, isolated family out in the woods somewhere. You know, there's not a lot of people. There's not yet a city or a town or a community. It's just a family by themselves with a farm, quite isolated.
The enormous success of Copland's Appalachian Spring did not go to his head. Despite worldwide attention and the sudden interest in his entire musical output, he was still the same good-natured and modest person he'd always been.
He was an extremely temperate person. He was never known to eat too much or drink too much. He was extremely balanced in the way he led his life and was the sort of the opposite of an sensualist. He was very restrained in the conduct of his life.
He was fundamentally, I think, absolutely direct with you. And I think this is something you hear in his music. The more I think about his personality, he was the kind of person who was direct, even a little bit blunt. He would rehearse the orchestra and he would often ask them, "Don't play so Tchaikovsky, don't play so Massenet," you know? He wanted things to be quite simple.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, da 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 da. Yes, right there. I'll take the 3/4. Don't bother to play. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Oh, 1, 2. Yes, don't hurry. Keep it in the same. You're rushing me a bit. 43. 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 1. Watch it. 1, 2, 3, 4. I beat out the 3, 4, 1. Da 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 da.
Copland's philosophy of life was characteristically tolerant. What mattered most to him was the individual and his or her personal idiosyncrasies, regardless of colour, character or gender.
He did have aspirations for a better society and a better world. And some of his activities involved a leftist sensibility, even to the point of writing a May Day song in the 1930s. And many of his works carry with it a message of hope, of tolerance, of brotherhood.
His most obviously political work was the Lincoln Portrait, using the great liberal reformer's own words. The piece, written for speaker and orchestra, and often performed by the composer's close friend Leonard Bernstein, was to create problems for Copland during the McCarthy era.
Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. That is what he said. That is what Abraham Lincoln said. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. Even we here hold the power and bear the responsibility.
In the 50s in America, if you had been left wing, in the 50s you got into trouble. There was a terrible reactionary backlash. There were hearings in the Congress, and Copland was called in front of the hearings to answer, why were you a communist in the 30s? And I think this is a very unpleasant time for many intellectuals, and I think it made their optimism about America change.
The dogmas of the past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. When standing erect, he was 6 feet 4 inches tall. And this is what he said. He said, "It is the eternal struggle between two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. It is the same spirit that says, you toil and work and earn bread, and I'll eat it, no matter in what shape it comes, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race. It is the same tyrannical principle."
Senator Joseph McCarthy's hysterical fear of communist infiltration affected large areas of the United States. Performances of Copland's music were banned.
I just felt like a kind of a pawn in his machinations, I'd call them. How he happened to arrive at me, I don't have any idea. But it wasn't a very pleasant thing to go through. However, one goes through it and lives on, and so that was that.
For many years, Copland concentrated predominantly on instrumental music. He had little feeling for song, until he discovered the verse of the American poet Emily Dickinson.
The match of Emily Dickinson and Copland is remarkable, especially considering that on the one hand you have a woman poet of the mid-19th century and an American composer of the mid-20th century. Somehow we find a meeting of the minds with these two artists.
Copland set 12 of Emily Dickinson's poems to music. Later, he arranged 8 of them for full orchestra. Here, his songs, There Came a Wind Like a Bugle, Heart We Will Forget Him, and Going to Heaven, are sung by Stella Dufexis.
There came a
Dickinson herself is such a contemporary poet in her sensibilities. She's such a modern poet that it really took the 20th century to discover her.
Going to heaven, going to heaven. I don't know where. Pray do not ask me how. Indeed, I'm too astonished to think of answering you. Going to heaven, going to heaven. I'm glad I don't believe it, for it would stop my breath.
Copland was constantly on the move. He toured the world, always returning to his home base in New York City. His taste for travel became even more intense with advancing age and steadily growing fame. Without the slightest hesitation, he would accept invitations to give concerts in the four corners of the earth.
Yes, travel was extremely important to him, and he often advised people to travel. He would say, tell people, for instance, to go to Rio de Janeiro. He said, you'll love Rio or you'll hate Rio, but it will be an experience.
From one of his early trips to Mexico in the 1930s, Copland brought back a musical souvenir, El Salón Mexico, a distillation of the musical sounds of the country. Copland wrote the piece after spending the whole night in a Mexican dance hall. He translated what he heard there into his own symphonic language. In the 1960s, Copland was at the pinnacle of his career. As a celebrated composer and conductor, he was a superb ambassador for America. It never even occurred to him to retire. Quite the opposite. He was still enthusiastically working on new projects and surprised the world with what was for him a fairly atypical work: connotations.
For Copland, it was very important always to feel that he was doing something new, not to get old. He had tremendous success with Rodeo and Appalachian Spring. He became really a household, wonderfully popular figure in American culture. So instead of just doing that over and over like a lesser composer would have done, he completely abandons that and starts writing in the 12-tone style. I think just because he wanted the challenge, he wanted to do things in a new way.
Like Stravinsky, Copland did not turn to the 12-tone system, so characteristic of the 20th century, until late in life. But his connotations still bear his distinctive stamp. Despite the restrictions of the compositional process, they still have that Copland sound.
It was not a successful piece, Connotations. It was written for the opening of Lincoln Center in New York, a big gala, lots of conservative politicians, John Kennedy and his wife. I think they were not so happy. For some artists, the only way to go forward is to say, I'm right, they're wrong. I think in Copland's personality, that was not important. He didn't have this ego that needed to say, I'm right, they're wrong. He could say, I'm right, and they're right, but I'm doing it this way today. And tomorrow, maybe I'll do something else.
Copland was successful at balancing these two artistic directions, if you will, one toward profundity, depth, sophistication, and the other toward accommodating such sophistication and depth so that a large numbers of people could appreciate and assimilate and absorb the music.
Aaron Copland, who lived to be almost as old as the century, asked no more of life than to be a musical mirror of the world in which he lived. Along with Gershwin, Ives and Bernstein, Copland represents the American chapter in the history of music. A chapter that began barely 100 years ago with a rousing fanfare and went on to conquer the world.